really want to work with the editor in all cases. If you think that you're going to have a delay, if you agreed to review something, but it turns out that you can't do it anymore, that's fine. Just make sure that you let the editor know. And in all cases, you are trying to improve the manuscript. It's not your job as the peer reviewer to give a reason why it shouldn't be published. You're trying to make sure that the journal publishes the best content that it can and making sure that the authors put their work out there in the best way they can. But we do have some differences. I would say maybe the most important one is that in a research article, you want it to be accessible, you want to communicate it well, but this is essential for review articles. So a review article that is not easy to interpret really serves no purpose at all. There's no methodology, data analysis, statistics to evaluate in reviews. So if you accept an invitation to review a review article, you're not being asked to say, whether the author's numerical conclusions are right or whether they've used the right statistical tests. Back to this point about novelty. So we're looking at how the authors are choosing to discuss the field rather than the results that they found. Do they have a new perspective, a new way to analyze old data maybe? And it's also really important to distinguish consensus from author opinion. So if the authors are writing reviews to advance their hypothesis, that can be a really interesting thing for the field, but they need to make sure that they say it's our hypothesis rather than it's what the whole field believes. And finally, timeliness is a really big deal. You can have a research article that talks about a topic that's been investigated recently, and it can still be interesting. But if we have a lot of reviews on the same topic, it's going to dilute the impact of all of them because they might not all have different things to say. We'll talk more about those guidelines about how to specifically review reviews in a few minutes, but I'd like to start by talking a little about who might be invited to review a review. And generally, the answer is anyone who might submit to the same journal. So if you have recent publishing or research expertise in the topic, especially if your own work has been cited in the review manuscript, then you're probably going to be an excellent reviewer. There's a lot of misconceptions floating around about the author recommendations for reviewers, and I want to assure you that the editors do take author recommendations into account. I personally always invite the suggested reviewers unless I have a good reason not to. And a good reason might be they're already reviewing for the journal or they just recently did, and I don't want to overburden the person. If there's an obvious conflict of interest, or if I review the person's expertise and I don't think it's quite right for the manuscript. I never invite an opposed reviewer. So if you have a good reason to say this person is not going to give a fair evaluation of the work, I'm not going to invite that person. I have had colleagues tell me that people have tried to exclude entire universities or countries, and that's taking a little bit too far. That's probably not something that we can feasibly do. Personally, I think that postdocs, other early career researchers can be great reviewers because they are most connected with the literature, yet have the expertise to know if an article is sufficiently novel and timely. And if you're a more established researcher, a PI, a senior investigator, you can feel free to include your trainees, especially for reviewing the reviews. It's just courteous to let the editor know. I mentioned conflicts of interest. I get asked about this all the time, so I just wanted to add a few points about this. Editors can catch some of the most basic conflicts. If there's multiple publications between a suggested reviewer and an author of an article in the last few years, I think that's a little bit too close to be an objective source of opinion. If you're currently collaborating, especially, or if you have affiliations in common. So, if you're from the same department at the same university, or the same branch of a government organization, something like that, I probably won't invite that person to review. Some things that I don't consider a conflict. So if you've published a few papers together in the past, especially if it's a many author study or one of these consensus statements, I think that's fine. I think you can still be objective. If you previously collaborated, previously visited each other's labs, especially if it's long enough ago, I think that's fine. And then if you've done other professional activities together, panels, conferences, if you are co-academic editors of a different journal, I think that's fine too. But there are some important sources of conflict that the editor usually cannot catch. If you're starting a new collaboration, you haven't published together yet, it's hard for me to know about that. If you're personally friends or if you're married to each other, I might not understand that. And so if I accidentally invite somebody's spouse to review, I really, really hope that they tell me I can't do it because I'm too close to this person. And finally, if you had a long ago mentor trainee relationship, I'm usually not digging into your publication history decades ago. And so if you postdoc in somebody's lab in 2002 and I invite you to review their paper, I don't necessarily know that, but it would really help me if you're forthcoming about that relationship. Now, okay, I know your time is busy. I know you have a lot of obligations. Let's say that you get that email inviting you to review a review manuscript. Why might you want to accept it? I promise there are good reasons. The sort of buy-in payout of, okay, I submit research and then I know that somebody else needs to review my research, that I think tends to be an easier sell for research articles than for review articles. Because even if you're invited to review a review, you may never write a review yourself. However, I still think there are really compelling reasons that you might want to be a peer reviewer for a review article. First one, they're short, they're easy to read. It's not going to take that much of your time, especially relative to a complicated research article with a lot of statistics and a lot of interesting data that you have to sort through. You might learn something. So I'm inviting you because I think you're an expert in at least some aspect of the review, but I publish a lot of things that are so multidisciplinary that no one person can really be an expert in the whole thing. For example, I just had a manuscript submitted that was about algae and using algae to synthesize platform chemicals. And so I had to invite reviewers that were experts in algae biology and bioengineering and process engineering. And no one person was an expert in the entire thing, but synthesizing their comments gave me a better sense of whether the manuscript is interesting enough to publish. It's really, really good way to make a relationship with an editor, whether that's a professional editor like me or an academic editor in a different journal. I'm asking for thoughtful, constructive comments, and if you give that to me, that's a really great way for me to understand that you're an authority on the topic, and maybe I invite you to write a review in the coming weeks or months. And finally, maybe the most important scientifically is that, again, going back to the idea of a review article having a really broad audience and being used to teach the field to new people, you have a say in how your own field is presented. So you can see how another expert wants to pitch the field to non-experts, and then you can add your voice to that by providing constructive comments as a peer reviewer. If you don't think you can do it, if you get an invitation and you just can't review, that's totally fine. Time and travel are the most common reasons. Sometimes I get emails from prospective reviewers saying they're on maternity leave, and obviously take care of your baby, not my manuscript. I had one guy tell me that a tree fell on his house and he needed to clean up. Obviously, I don't expect you to review for me under those circumstances, but just tell the editor. It's okay to decline, I promise. I do appreciate if you give a short reason. You don't need to type a whole paragraph. I really appreciate if you tell me whether you're willing to review for me in the future, and it's best of all if you can just provide one or two alternatives, people who are also experts who also might accept the invitation. If you never respond, I can't be sure if you ever got it. But the worst of all is if you do respond and you say, yes, I'll review, and you never submit your comments. Because in that case, I'm spending time chasing you to give your comments when I could be looking for other reviewers. The authors are getting frustrated because there's a delay, and it's sort of sitting around in our submission system with nothing apparent happening when we could be making the process go forward if you would just communicate with us. All right, so really getting into, I think, the meat of this topic is, let's say that you're convinced, you get the invitation, you think, yes, I love reviewing reviews now, I can definitely do it, there are no trees in my house. What do you comment on? I'm going to focus on three things: accuracy or lack thereof, duplication, and confusion. So the first thing, scientific accuracy is the single most important reason that you were invited. I invited you to review the review because you are a bigger expert in this scientific topic than I am. What are we looking for here? So are the scientific concepts that are explained in the review, are they correct according to how the field understands them right now? There's going to be a lot of terminology. There might be, abbreviations and glossaries and that sort of thing. Do the authors use those terms in a way that the field considers acceptable and correct? Is the most important recent research cited? When I say recent, I usually mean the past 2 to 4 or 5 years. Other reviews journals might have different standards, so make sure that you understand what the journal is going for. When you're talking about those recent publications, are the authors presenting the data and the conclusions faithfully? So have they interpreted what the author of the research article said correctly, and are they then conveying that message correctly to the readers of the review? Does the manuscript cite anything that has been disputed, discredited, even retracted? I actually had this happen to me a couple of years ago where the authors of a review manuscript cited a study that they were not aware had been retracted because the results couldn't be replicated, and one of the reviewers caught this because they're closer to the literature than I am. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but sometimes authors give hypothesis versus try to present the prevailing opinion in the field versus give what are undisputed facts because they've been seen in multiple experiments. As a reviewer, I really want to make sure that you comment on whether you think that's accurate. So for instance, if the authors have their idea about how something works, make sure that the authors are saying that this is our idea rather than inadvertently communicating that's what the entire field thinks. Finally, and maybe most importantly of all, if a non-expert reads this manuscript, are they going to come away with a correct understanding of the topic as its practitioners see it right now? And if you think that a non-expert is going to read this and be confused, or even worse, come away with an incorrect understanding, that's maybe the single most important feedback you can give to me as a reviewer. So talking a little more about novelty, is this distinct from other recent reviews in the same topic? And it's not necessarily the case that if another review has been published recently, we can't publish a new one. We just need to make sure it's different enough. So maybe it considers the topic from a different angle. Maybe we're writing for a different audience. So maybe there's a bioengineering paper that previously has been reviewed in a biology context, and now we're reviewing it in a chemical engineering context. I think that's sufficiently different to merit a new review, but I think it's up to the reviewers to tell me where the scope is and how we might be able to play with the scope to make sure it's actually a new thing. Also, maybe if you're writing a more opinionated review or a perspective or an opinion article, if you're interpreting the same results differently, that could also be grounds to publish a new thing. And finally, yet again, I want to drive this home, is the main message clear? So maybe the authors don't have perfect grammar and usage. Maybe they're not native English speakers. That's totally fine. What I want you to comment on is whether you can understand what they're trying to say. Every manuscript that we publish is going to get copy edited, so all of those inconsistencies will be sorted out. But on a more fundamental scientific level, do you understand the point of why this manuscript has been written? Are the authors saying anything at all, or just regurgitating results? I'm sure everybody's read review articles that do a really nice job of listing current research and giving an up-to-date bibliography, but they don't really say anything beyond just replicating what the authors of the research studies found. And those kinds of reviews can be okay if you just want to collate the results in the same place, but the best review articles are the ones where the authors give a perspective, maybe it's some comparisons, maybe it's some directions for future research. And so as a reviewer, I want you to tell me whether the authors are just collecting results or if they're actually talking about the results. A few more minor points. So the topics that the authors choose to discuss, do you think their discussion is reasonable in terms of both manner and style? Sometimes you'll have the authors just spend a lot of time on their own results or their favorite recent publications, even if they're not from their lab, and they'll go on for paragraphs about details about how these results were obtained, how the experiments were conducted, and so on, and then essentially skim over 10 more papers in the next 2 sentences. We want to make sure that things are presented in a balanced manner, And so as a reviewer, I would like you to comment on if the results in the review are presented proportionally to how important you think they are to the field. Speaking of detail, I'm most interested in conclusions from the cited research. I'm not that interested in the experimental setups or even the underlying data. And I think the most important thing in a review article is for the authors to synthesize and not to reproduce. There might be some very new relevant articles. This might even be in the context of preprints, or it might be in a research journal's most recent issue that was published after the authors wrote the review. That's useful for me to know because I'm not necessarily that up to date with where the research in the field is, at least compared to you as a reviewer. And I would say if you want to ask the authors to cite your work, that's fine. You're an expert too, right? But in that case, please use common sense, use humility. Don't ask the authors to cite 40 of your own papers. At the very least, then the author is going to know who the reviewer is. But at the worst, that could constitute a major ethical violation. We don't want to be involved in that. Also, if you have any comments on the structure, that's useful for me. So for instance, maybe the authors have tried to cram a lot of quantitative information in the text. I see a lot of things with specific concentrations and wavelengths and experimental durations, those sorts of things. I think that's better presented in a table than in paragraphs, so you might want to comment on that. Is there a clear reasoning behind how the text is structured? So maybe it's from basic to applied science, maybe it's a historical organization. Any of that's okay, but make sure that you understand why the authors have organized their information as they have. And if there's not a clear reason behind it, maybe point that out to the editor too. And finally, on figures, this goes back to the point that I've been making about the authors simply reproducing research results versus actually commenting on them. I see figures all the time have panels A through J, and they're just little tiny pictures of data from research articles. And maybe some of them are bar graphs or spectra or pie charts without a lot of context. And I don't feel that really adds much to insight or to the point of the review. So if you see a lot of that, maybe give the author some suggestions for ways to make a more informative or abstract figure. We see, tiny small text and labels and colors that don't have a clear meaning. So if you don't understand why the figure is important to the manuscript or what the authors are trying to do with it, please comment on that.